So in the end of the day, we have this vision, but back in 1888 or even 1910, there was a unified area of everyone were living together, and people were living together, but pretty much in their own communities. This is something that we need to remember. The Ottomans had a very clear policy of breaking up communities to run them separate. And by the way, their legacies still live today. For example, something that is a big issue is the reality that in Israel, for example, and in the Palestinian Authority area, and even in other places in the Middle East, marriage is based on community laws. Therefore, it can only happen within the religious institutions. And we don't have a state institution of marriage in the Ottoman Empire. You decentralize institutions and you make people live together. So the Palestinians and the Jews, where maybe some of them were living together in specific places like Hebron, Jaffa, or Jerusalem, but in general, the Jewish community and the Palestinian community lived very separately. And it became even more apparent with time. And more than that, if you look at Tel Aviv, Tel Aviv, as founded in the Ottoman era, was the example of separate people in separate places. And it's also separate institutions. They had separate governance. They did not rule under the same state. They had the same sultan or emperor, however you want to describe it, but they were still living separately. And this map, you can see, of course, the map of the era. It was original map for administration. By the way, it doesn't mean the Palestinian identity did not exist. It doesn't mean the Israeli identity didn't exist. The Israeli identity was not called Israeli back then. It was called Tsabarnik. There was an idea already of a Jewish local in the land of Israel, or a Jewish local in later on Palestine, but exists in the separate communities. And let's be frank here, the British mandate of Palestine reinforced it. Many Jewish institutions became, from sports to national insurance to social security, and those institutions, like Israel, was in existence already in the 1920s, everything but by name. And also the Palestinian community began to formalize and become more centralized. So there is a process of in the end of the day, of creating a stronger centralized identity for the Palestinian, while the Jewish community, which was much smaller, by the way, was very centralized due to its small size. So even under the mandate of Palestine, we see two separate entities developing. And here I want to show you actually the example. In the era of the mandate of Palestine, we have three main steps. Okay, and each step clearly describes how each people saw themselves. On the left, there is a stamp of Palestine for the Arabs. This is when many of the Palestinians understood there is some issue of Jewish immigration. They were afraid of the reality. They were afraid that they are losing control, because they did see the Israeli institutions, or the Yishuv institution to be more exact, as more powerful, as more influential, while the Israelis, or the Yishuv, were building their own steps in Hebrew, separate from the Arab community and separate from the British mandate. And of course, we have the famous one with the British mandate that was disconnected from the civilians themselves. They were more running things on a higher level, and they were trying to please everyone. This is why we have this famous Palestine in English, Philistine in Arabic, Palestina in Hebrew, and then a small land of Israel as well within it. So even the British mandate understood they were dealing with two different entities from the beginning. And now I want to see, and I want to show, by the way, how each side perceived the reality, because both sides perceive the reality very differently. Okay? And when we're talking about 1947, before the partition, we have two different narratives. Okay? And both narratives can be true in the same time in some ways. One of them is on the right, where we see those Jewish communities popping up and created. Okay? And it seemed very centralized and seemed very separate than the Arab Palestinian, but it seems all over and all controlling. While the Israeli narrative, we're seeing actually a different picture. We're seeing a picture of many small plots. Some of them are privately owned, some of them are communally owned Arab plots, which are in green, solid green. The other are Jewish privately owned or communally owned in solid blue. And then most of the land was state land. And I can understand, by the way, and I do understand from both sides why the Palestinian and the Arabs justify say, oh, this state land was meant for my Palestinian state. While the Jewish side said the same thing. And the British side say, continue fighting for about who owns what, but I actually own the wide area. So there is already a formation of a two-state reality very, very early. And of course, from there, we know how the reality became. We got separated, hard separation, with massacres, with killing, with war. It was ethnic transfer of both sides, ethnic cleansing on both sides. For example, I can say my family specifically experienced the 1929 massacre in Hebron, and they need to leave to Jerusalem. But then it's a little bit more nuanced, as they actually got help from Jerusalemite Palestinians, and they switched houses in Jerusalem, and their house in Hebron. So there was some cooperation, and then I feel that 1947 actually killed most of the cooperation to a very two entities, where Israel consolidated to his own territory. The Palestinians got controlled by the Egyptians and the Jordanians. And this is where I think most of us know what the history from here. But there is need to understand that the Egyptian government already actually something I discovered recently, in 1949, 1950, was trying to establish a Palestinian government, okay, in Gaza. So, and it actually failed because of a Jordanian annexing the West Bank. So there is a reality in this place where we have a clear two states. And we never had a one state until now. And this is something that we need to remember here. The only time we had probably the opportunity for a one state, ironically enough, is after 1967, where I will say, and everyone knows this map, that Israel took control of the West Bank, took control of Gaza, took control of Sinai, later on gave Sinai back in a peace agreement with Egypt. And this reality was probably the only time, which was very short, was probably for around 20 years, when we had a one-state reality. But very quickly, we have today. And today's reality is the complicated one, not the easy one, but the one that this direction is very clear. We're talking about a creation of right now of actually today practically we have three states minus, I will call it like that, but we have a clear Israeli state that controls Palestinian life, control part of their lifestyle, their economic activity, and many other things. And I'm not talking about Gaza right now, I'm talking about the West Bank, where the West Bank, Israel has a lot of influence, and we'll see why. But we have also the reality of a formation of the PA, under the PLO. And the PA, with all its corruption and with all its minuses, is starting to becoming a state in every word there is. And it's not there yet. And I will later on provide the argument of what Israel, as an Israeli, and Israel should do in order to make this a reality. But today, if you go to Bethlehem, if you go to Hebron, if you go to Jenin, you don't see Israeli IDs in the cars. You see the Ministry of Transportation of the PA. You see the Ministry of Water of the PA. You see ministries that are disconnected from the Israeli government in any sense. There is a state within a state in some ways, and now telling me to liquidate everything, it's something that the PA will never, I believe, will never give up power that easily. It's not something that Israel actually wants. So anyone who is talking about one state first needs to destroy at least 3 states in the process, including Hamas. And this reality no one actually talks about when they're talking about the one state. It's easy to tell someone, let's form this, but let's destroy the reality of today. And of course, no one will fight against this reality. And this is where I think the problem arises, especially because the one state talk started from the outside, actually. It started from in America, it started in Europe, and by the way, also from Jewish diaspora and Palestinian diaspora. Because if you truly, and let's thoroughly complicate the issue, Hamas and the Gaza Strip and Israel are disconnected in every way. Although there is a one electric line, although there's one water pipe, it doesn't mean Israel actually has control of Gaza Strip. It does provide a blockade, of course. People there, of course, are suffering. But you're telling me that in a one-state solution, you're liquidating Israel, the government, that doesn't want to be liquidated, and Hamas that doesn't want to be liquidated? This is nonsense. I
want to make sure I understand this chart here. It's because it's interesting. So the blue would be Israel proper. The circle would be Israel's control. So they're showing that they control Israel proper and part of the West Bank. That would be Area C. Right? Yes, am I understanding this correctly?
It's metaphorically. I don't want to. This is actually Area C is 60%, and it seems a little bit less. But it is a metaphorical. But in the end of the day, we have the PLO, but once in a while is also Hamas. Not today, if I'm not mistaken. Which the PLO represents the diaspora and the PA. Well, the PA is this small red circle, and Hamas, but its own separate green circle, controlling its own people. And of course, Israel is affecting the reality here. But if we look at, in practice, the direct control of what we consider governance and state control, it's very minimal. It affects Palestinians, but it's the Israeli bureaucrat in the end of the day doesn't even know how to deal with a Palestinian population unless he view them as a non-Israeli entity, or I don't want to use the word foreigners, but as to use them as non-Israelis and non-residents as well, by the way. So Israeli institutions are built today to view them as a separate state, actually. And this is something maybe people will be surprised, but today when there is a planning process, the West Bank is excluded, Gaza is excluded. Very few times there is inclusion of the West Bank in planning processes, etc. Israel made sure in 1967 not to actually integrate administration within the West Bank for many reasons. But now I want to go to the complicated part of today's reality, of why, if we arrive to where we arrived, and which is, by the way, in the 90s was the right direction from both sides, I believe, of the Oslo Accord, of Oslo 1 and Oslo 2. But we arrived to what it seems, a blockade for both sides, by the way. And it seems this blockade is created by the perception, and I think this will surprise Americans, I think it surprised Europeans, I think it will surprise Palestinians and Israelis, that both sides perceive the other side as the stronger and the weaker in the same time. And this sounds absurd. I understand that. As Israeli, of course, our army is strong, or it seems strong. As a Palestinian, we know that our demographic threat is the number threat for the Israelis. And I think the problem that we are arriving today, that both sides think time is on their side. And this is why we don't see any movement. Because if time is on your side, you have no reason to decide. And this is probably what we need to understand why nothing is happening. Because from both, and by the way, I'll show an example, a concrete example of how it's being perceived. If you think your position will improve with time, you will wait. This is why was the actually policy of Bibi publicly, to wait and see for a better partner, while the position of the PA or the PLO was not necessarily wait and see, but let's just be active in places that they agree with us 100% with our positions. And the biggest example of how this perceived of power that I'm stronger and they're stronger. By the way, doesn't mean the Palestinians think they're stronger militarily or anything like that, but just there's a perception that with time they can actually ask for more or receive more as well. And I actually took two ideas, one from a Israeli, I'll call it right-wing Israeli think tank, and one from a quote, a famous quote by Yasser Arafat, where the Yasser Arafat said, and I'm paraphrasing right now, that the Palestinian biggest weapon is the Palestinian womb. The idea that eventually the Palestinians will populate the entirety of historic Palestine, and of course then it will be a one-state reality. On the other, the right-wing Israeli think tank said, oh, look at the demographic issue. It's actually not an issue. Actually, Jewish women are making more babies. We just need to wait, and our position will get better. So both sides think they can wait. And waiting usually is not a good solution for anything. And I'll give you an example. There was a general in the Yugoslavian war that was talking about the issue of refugees in Kosovo and Serbia and Croatia. And he said that we have two options. Even look at reality and try to make the best for the refugees today, or to insist of returning to what was and let the refugees suffer for years or even generations. When I read this quote, I thought I was actually reading about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. This quote actually refers to a different conflict, but they decided to see the reality of today and move forward in order to provide a solution for all people. And we're not talking about, Yugoslavia was not two people, it was several people, and it was very complicated and it was very bloody, but they decided to finish and provide a solution to resolve the conflict. And by the way, and this is where I want to actually show where wait and see tactic can result a very good or a very bad result. And the best example I'll probably say is the Golan Heights. In 1974, Israel and the Syrians decided to sign an agreement, but Syria, by the way, if someone wants to read it, they're welcome to read. Syria agreed that Israel will occupy the Golan Heights until they reach a final resolution on an international border. Right now, we don't have an international border. Right now, we have a temporary line, a line that doesn't reflect what probably the Syrian people want. And I understand that. But the waiting and waiting and waiting created a situation that today, that the language changed from occupation to a border dispute. And I know it's not the West Bank. The Golan Heights is a little bit different. But from the Syrian perspective, they lost a lot of will from the international community in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010, and today. While Egypt decided to go and do a move in a few years. And by the way, it just shows that time is on no one's side. And it can be, by the way, it also could be for Israeli. It could not be good for Israel, maybe in the long run as well, but this is a different conversation. A second example of what happened when we don't do anything is the Blue Line. Israel was occupying the Litani until the Litani River, or South Lebanon, until 2000. And this is something that people are surprised. Israel and Lebanon never had an international border. They never agreed where the line crosses. And the Lebanese government decided not to talk to the Israelis, justifiably or not. But it created a reality that Israel approached the UN and told the UN, let us make a line. This line we'll call the disengagement line. It will not be international border. And this will decide, but we are not occupying Lebanon anymore. And the UN agreed, drew this line. And now Lebanon are asking for an area called the Shaba Farm or Mount Tal. And internationally, they don't have any legitimacy to those requests. So this is where actually time again was not on the Lebanese side. And Although today there are some tactical issues, but I will not get into it. So where are we today? And let me make it clear, I'm talking from an Israeli perspective. For me, as an Israeli, I don't ask what the Palestinian can do. It doesn't mean they cannot do anything. I ask what I, as an Israeli, what I expect from the Israeli government and state and people to do. And we can look at three options that are presented. And it's not an accurate representation of those people's opinion, but I think it reflects a nice picture of what happened. Bibi is in the position of managing the conflict without a political goal. He's saying, I can create a reality where Israelis can go sleep at night and not be aware that the conflict exists. I can minimize, I can buffer up security in Gaza. I can buffer up the security in the West Bank. And we can keep the reality as it is until I will wait for someone that is willing to compromise on what I want. Okay, and this was, by the way, official policy. It's something that was inside the government. It was outside in speeches, if you study the speeches well. And then we have a position of Sharon, also Umert, I will say, and maybe even Rabin in some ways, that yes, there is a conflict. You need to manage it, but you need to have a goal and responsibility. Meaning, but Sharon decided, listen, I know that I don't want to control the people of Gaza. I don't want to control the people in the West Bank. Therefore, I should do a move myself in order to eventually be in a reality that I can solve the conflict with the Palestinians. The idea is that, and by the way, it's an idea that I'm an Israeli and many Israelis really believe after the Second Intifada. But right now, the Palestinians are incapable of reaching an agreement because of key issues that also Israel is incapable of achieving. And to do the formula of land for peace, which was the formula since 1967, is not working anymore. Because right now, Israelis and Palestinians are incapable of achieving compromise that both can agree on. So this is where, as an Israeli, I think we need to create a reality where we help the Palestinians be in a better position for themselves, and with an Israeli, morally and practically, by the way. And for Israelis, the practical side is more important. For the international community, the moral question is more important. But to minimize the occupation, okay, not in order to keep the reality as it is, but in order to be in a better position for a two-states reality. And those positions are held, you'll be surprised, by almost every party beside one small extreme right party on different levels. Even Bennett, that in 2012 had a proposal of annexing Area C, seems he even himself moved more to the left on those positions. Again, I understand that he needs to do the move. Sharon, that was a lifelong Likud, moved into those issues, and it's Olmert as well. And eventually, I want to be in a place where we can have someone, because even we have Rabin today, by the way, even if we have Meretz today in the government, I don't see with a whole resolution being achieved today, but I do think Israel can improve the infrastructure of achieving peace tomorrow. And this is the important key that we need to promote it in Israelis. And this is now the very theoretical world that we're talking until now. But let's look at actual proposals that people used to look at, and I think that people are looking at today again. And by the way, this may look familiar, but not fully familiar for people. And not many people know that, but Sharon had a bigger plan than 2005, and not only to leave Gaza, but also to leave many places in the West Bank. And the first phase was to leave actually the Northwest Bank or the Jenin area. And the idea is that, yes, Israel is still maintaining some of the settlements, especially the big ones, which, by the way, represents more than 80% or 75% of the actual people who lives in settlements. This is something that I want to note. But it's about leaving the core areas for the Palestinians in order for them to build governance. Because if you live in Jenin, with this map, you can drive to Nablus without seeing one Israeli soldier, without seeing one Israeli police, without seeing one Israeli citizen. And this was, I think, the right direction to go to. And I'm not reading the comments yet, but I believe someone will say, or, whoa, you're doing this, and Hamas went to power. And I agree, Hamas did go to power. And by the way, you know who actually said Hamas will go to power if we will do that? The Palestinians, okay? In 2004, at 5, Erkat actually sent a letter to Bush telling him, and you can read the letter, that if Israel will do disengagement unilaterally, they will lose legitimacy. And I agree with them. This will happen under Sharon, because now we need to talk the problem of the 2005. The problem was not a disengagement. The problem is that we did not try to provide credit to the right people. And the PA was more engageful than Hamas back then. The PA should have received the credit by at least showing diplomatic success, at least by showing the true credit to where we're going, and not violent resistance. This is why since 2005, the Palestinians, they look at the Israelis like, look, only after the Intifada you left Gaza. What were you thinking? Of course we will continue to fight. Resistance is the only thing that achieved anything. And if you look at history, it looks like that. However, I think it's actually not that 100% true. And this is why the past resistance we saw did not create anything, did not create any political achievement to the Palestinian people. And this is why we need to be very careful in saying only resistance achieve anything. And this is now I want to show actually plans that were never published, but only went through protocols. And those are maps created by a researcher on the conflict by Shaul Arieli. And he said, look, Sharon had a plan 2.0. On the right, we see the current reality of enclaves of the Palestinian people. Sharon was talking about slowly expanding. And by the way, disengaging in small settlements in the West Bank in order to create a governance that is continuous but is more independent and hopefully more looking like a state than a chain of violence. And here we can already see actually settlements that still exist. And I don't want to name them right now because it's not about me saying this guy should go or this girl should go. It's about showing that those settlements that are pointed out, and by the way, one of them actually has my last name there, are actually very small settlements. We're talking about few hundreds, okay? We're talking about settlements that are disconnected from the Israeli infrastructure, that are disconnected from Israel proper in many ways. They're disconnected from the settlement block. Those elements are very ideological driven, and they make life hell to Palestinians. And it's not only because of the recent violence we're talking about, it's also because of practical reasons. For example, if you look at South Hebron, you see there are probably, I don't know if you can see it, but you can see here there are three main roads that actually cross the Hebron area. And those three roads are controlled by but there are 4 settlements presented there. Those 4 settlements are a few hundred people. Creates the reality that the IDF needs to be there to protect the settlements. It creates the reality that in order to connect infrastructure from water to electricity, there need to be approval with the Israeli government. And the moment there need to be an approval with the Israeli government, what will happen if the Israeli government and the Palestinians are not on the best term? So you cannot really help your own people, even if you want to, by the way. And those things Israel can solve today, because we already saw And this is actually something that many people will be surprised, but even Likud agreed to disengage from most of those settlements in a future agreement. So now, as an Israeli, I can say something, that those areas need to be considered first in order to do the first move. I understand that we cannot do a one whole agreement today for a two-state reality, but we can improve the likelihood of a two-state by disengaging in the places that we already said that we're not willing to actually control in the future. And we can use this as a tool to force also the PA to, first of all, to tell them, listen, we'll provide you the credit. Because credit to do, you actually maintain the peace in the West Bank for so many years, relatively. If we think about it, the West Bank was very peaceful. By providing this territory as a win, they can show to their people we are succeeding. And this is the reality. You never run if you don't have success. One of the reasons we don't have elections within the PA, because they're incapable of providing any success to their people. A mayor will not run until he fixes the road in the city. And we need to help the Palestinians to fix the roads in the city in order for them to even have an election. An election will create more accountability. It will create more legitimacy, what the PA really needs. The PA will be more flexible to be more engageful with Israel on security, on planning, on visas, etc. And maybe the Palestinians can do their own first move, but for the Israelis, we today have options to move today. And this is just a plan from 2005. There are also more modern plans that we can go over. A second one is actually someone you brought, which is Olmert. You were talking about the 2008 proposal. I will actually first talk about the 2006 idea. His idea was to do re-enlightenment, or in Hebrew, he called it, actually there are several names for it, but the idea was to consolidate the settlement block. And here we have something that looks less like an island, more like a 3 big islands, which is an improvement. And the idea is not necessarily to have it be the final borders, but first of all, it will improve Palestinians' life. But from an Israeli perspective, it will, and this is me being frank, if Israel will have done that, the conflict will have minimized to much less, and the conflict will have been more about how to fix the borders, how to fix economic issues. And from Israeli perspective, it will also allow, and this is me being very, very, very frank, to forget about the question about the right of return. This is why the Palestinians are actually also against one-sided move by the Israelis. Not because they're afraid of Hamas only, but because I understand that if Israel decides the borders and improves their situation, the card for the right of return decreases. And now we can talk how to solve the right of return without having the right of return, or have something similar to that. But this is actually why I think Israel's strategic goal, which was very clear by every prime minister since the 90s, is actually to disengage eventually with the Palestinians or without the Palestinians. And the reality also that the settlers don't like to mention, most of the growth of the settlements are actually internal. Most of the growth are actually in 2 big settlements, which are Beitar Elite and I forgot the second one, but Beitar Elite and the other elite, Modi'in Elite, which are actually very close to the green line. They're actually part of the settlement block. They are ultra-Orthodox settlements, and they constitute most of the growth of the settlement. And the smaller ones, although they're growing very slowly, and there's less legitimacy to them as they used to be in under other administrations, especially after the 2001 agreement with Bush. So we have a reality that Israel can actually break the paradigm of Bibi, of wait and see, and go back to paradigm of Sharon to do, and this will create a 2-state solution. My fear, and this is an honest fear, but we will have a 2 states without peace, we'll have a two states without cooperation, and we'll have a two states without the ability of a Palestinian from Ramallah to drive to Tel Aviv for tourism or drive to Jerusalem to pray, or a reality that Israeli cannot drive to Hebron and be there and go to their places, or travel in the West Bank and hike in the Judean hills. This is a reality that I'm actually more afraid of. And this is where, an Israeli, we need to make sure that if we create a one-sided move, it's in order to push for more cooperation and not to push for bigger walls. And I think this is something we need to be careful in the current administration, the Israeli administration, by Bennett. I feel Lapid is more approaching to cooperative approach. And this is the number one thing that I'm actually worried about. And the one-state reality, it's a reality that is less likely every day, not more likely. Because every government in the Israeli administration, even the right wing, by the way, which recently decided, people who used to be, let's annex the West Bank, like, oh, let's go to the Trump plan. But Trump actually moved many people on the right to the left because they understand they don't actually want to annex the West Bank. So we're talking about a reality that even the far right, not extreme right, but the far right, are actually more open for a two-state solution than ever before. And this is a reality that Israel is capable of doing, and slowly it seems to have a bigger coalition to act. And this is why you'll probably hear the term shrinking the conflict. And shrinking of the conflict can be a two-sided sword. As I said, it's either can be about deciding the borders by Israel without cooperation, or Israel disengaging initially in order to build more cooperation in the future to allow a place where the Palestinian and the Israeli side are much closer in the ability to agree for a resolution. And I think Israel can break this paradigm that by only by doing and not by not acting, because this reality, and I want for Israelis to look at this as well, this reality doesn't make any sense. You cannot live in a state like that. Look at those green dots. This is not a reality, but you cannot build roads to solve this. I apologize. This is like Bennett 2012 plan. Even he understood it's unrealistic. Okay? And the Trump plan, it's maybe a little bit closer to reality, but I think we can look at the Trump plan and say, first of all, there are places that even the far right is willing to give up. Second of all, I think some of you can see the small dots. Both are the same, interesting enough, both are the same settlements that Sharon was actually thinking to disengage. So this is also a food for thought. So also those small enclaves, and we know are impossible to defend. They'll be actually abandoned probably in a real plan. So we already have even a list of places that are less likely to be kept within Israeli state. And this is why we need to seriously look at past plans to understand that this reality, okay, is closer to reality. And it's closer to, by the way, to a reality that if Israel will act unilaterally, to maybe in the future create an agreement that is more acceptable to the Palestinians. And I want to go to the final picture. And I think this is what people must understand. The goal for both nations, the Palestinians and the Jewish people, okay, is to create a kin state. A kin state is it's a new term that the European created for a friendly nation state. It's a way to describe a state that it represents a culture, that represents a people, that represents the people not only within the state, but also within the diaspora. Okay? And kin states is actually a concept that became really strong in Europe, especially after the rise of the EU, especially after World War II. And we need to accept that as much as the Israeli people, the Jewish people have a need for self-determination, and have a need to have a state to represent their peoplehood, not only in Israel but around the world. Also, the Palestinians are requesting the same thing. Ironically, the Palestinians are just Zionists, but for their own people, as much as the Jews are Zionists for their own people. And I know many people will say this is against the nation state. This is against the idea of internationalism is against the idea of nation state. We're moving to more international world, and I agree. We are being more unified. We're one human race, but in the old world, we, in the end of the day, nation states. The US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, all those countries are actually abnormal. They're not the usual countries. They're actually the unique countries that we should be inspired by. Okay? The EU is trying to do something similar. But even the EU is built from many states that represent their own nation. Okay? If it's the UK that still has their own state religion, but they still have their own institution for the Scottish people, for the Welsh people, for the English people, or is it Hungary, or is it Netherlands, or is it Spain, or is it Portugal? In the end of the day, those states are trying to integrate, but they're integrating as separate entities. And if you are actually for a one state, if you're actually for a federation, if you're actually for a confederation, first you need to build the first block. First step is to build the two-state reality. And by the way, it doesn't need to be the 1967 line, but it needs to be something that is acceptable and respectable as much as you expect to be in a state that looks acceptable and respectable. And this is where Israel can do the first move if you're for any of those solutions. So two states is not dead. It's right now the only possibility to build for any other solution. And this is how I will probably conclude my statement. And I do recommend, in the end of the day, for outsiders to really come and see the two states reality that is already formed in many ways. And I do recommend for Israelis to actually critically look at things that the Israeli government already compromised, and to understand that there's no need to fight for something that we ourselves decide that we will not want to keep, not only for moral reasons, which it's very important, but also for practical utilitarian reasons. And here I want to conclude. And by the way, I think we have a lot to talk about, because there is also the issue of Jerusalem, which is very controversial, the issue of the right of return. But all those issues can actually have creative solutions, which we can talk about in the future, but can have creative solutions within the context of the two states. If it's by providing special visas for Israelis and Palestinians another 10 years, but maybe Palestinians can live in Israel in special visa, but they still have their own Ken state, or Israelis live in the West Bank in special visa program. Those things are possible, but only if we're going to a two states, two Ken states, two cooperative state, or maybe in the future confederation or federation, whatever people will, whatever I hope my children will like. And this is something we need to remember.
Thank you. Oh, that was very informative.